Hello, I'm Morgan Jorgensen, Donor Relations and Events Manager for the Truman Library Institute. Welcome to Out of the Archives, the Atomic Bomb. This is the latest installment in our series of digital programming commemorating the 75th anniversary of Truman's presidency. Today, we're joined by Mark Adams, Director of Education at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The conclusion of the 45-minute presentation, there will be a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. Questions can be submitted during and immediately following the remarks via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Mark Adams.
Thank you, Morgan, and thank you, Truman Library Institute, and in particular, Alex Burton, for inviting me to do this presentation this evening. What I would like to do tonight is to show you a number of artifacts, objects, photographs, documents, three-dimensional artifacts related to the 75th anniversary of the atomic bomb. Each of those I'm going to present to you digitally, and then we're going to have some questions in the chat box at the end. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I'm going to go right in and look at our first artifact, which is actually not from July of 1945, but from April, shortly after Truman became president. Then we're going to look at some documents from July, and you can see my timeline here of the first 5 documents we're going to show you. And then we'll have another 5 to finish off as we get into August of 1945, and even some from later into the 60s that connect to this topic. So the first information that Truman has about the Manhattan Project comes in April, just 12 days after he becomes president on April 12th. And this very famous letter, some of you are probably very familiar with, is when Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War, writes to Truman to tell him about this highly secret matter, as it mentions in that first paragraph. Now, Stimson had mentioned this to Truman after his inauguration on April 12th, after FDR's death, but just in passing, and tells him when they need to talk about it in the future. And just under 2 weeks later, Stimson sends this letter to Truman, telling him they need to get together quickly so he can tell him about this project. And you can see some interesting handwritten notes on here. At the bottom, what I like to point out in Harry Truman's own handwriting, he writes, Matt, put on list tomorrow, Wednesday the 25th, HST. Matt is Matthew Colony, his appointment secretary, and he's obviously telling Mr. Connolly to get Henry Stimson on his calendar for the next day. Now, interestingly, Truman did come across the Manhattan Project when he was a senator in charge of the Truman Committee looking at overspending during World War II. He didn't really get into much detail as he started to see the budget numbers about the project, but Stimson actually is the person that warned him off and said, you can't investigate that anymore, let it go. Now, of course, he's president, and Stimson tells him more about the project. It's interesting, too, that in those 82 days as vice president, Truman did not know about the Manhattan Project. It takes him becoming president before he is told about the project. Of course, at this point, they've not done a successful test, but the work has been going on in 2 or 3 different locations, actually, as they start to develop the atomic bomb that we'll hear more about during the rest of this evening's presentation. So this is the first document I wanted to share with you out of the 10 artifacts that I'm going to share tonight, because it really provides the context of when Truman first finds out about the Manhattan Project and those interesting anecdotes that he didn't know while he was vice president. He'd come closer to it as a senator, and it's about 2 weeks after he's president where Stimson sits down and gives him all the detail. Now, Stimson, who'd actually, obviously worked in the FDR administration, is really the person that's in charge of the whole operation. He's the one that's supervising the work of Groves, who we're going to come across later on with another document. And so Stimson is the one that's the conduit between the White House and what's going on in New Mexico. So he's an important key figure in all of this. The second document we're going to look at is from Lieutenant Groves, And this is, and you can see the date at the top of the page. This is from July the 16th, 1945. And this is after the first test in New Mexico of the atomic bomb. And this is a sketch that was included in a 14-page report that Groves sends to Stimson. And then, of course, that is relayed to Truman. Now, we're going to learn more about this in a second. But of course, President Truman at this time is at the Potsdam Conference in Germany, meeting with Stalin and initially Winston Churchill, before Churchill is replaced after the British election. Now, this 14-page report is very detailed. It's not an official report, and it's actually quite casual in its writing, as the excitement and the wonderment of the scientists and the military people involved in this first successful test really comes through in the report. But this sketch is on the last page of that 14-page report. On the second page, Lieutenant Groves actually refers to the mushrooming cloud, and that's the first time that the word mushroom cloud is really used in that concept. And they describe the explosion as being beautiful and all the different colors in the sky that they see. Now, looking at this particular document, some of the handwritten cursive might be tricky for some of us to read, but if you go close in on this, underneath where it says cloud drawings, and it's a little faint, but it does say first atomic bomb explosion, Alamogordo, New Mexico, sketches from a B-29 flying at 30,000 feet, about 15 miles away. In fact, the B-29s that were sent up there for observation couldn't get as close as they would have liked because of the weather. You can also see the time dated there. So you can see 5:30, 5:38, and so on, then 5:42 at the bottom for the second part of the sketch. And so you can see they've done this first thing in the morning. It was really dependent upon the weather when they were going to do this test. And then the report itself goes into more detail about the level of destruction and the impact it had. And Truman uses those exact words from those reports in some other documents that we're going to see a bit later on, namely his diary entries. It also talks about the colors, dark brown, light gray, and so on. And then it says see through here in the hole in the middle of the cloud. And then it also gives the elevation. So, of course, later on, we're able to see photographs and other footage of this atomic cloud. But this is what Truman receives while he's in Germany, and it's relayed to him via Stimson to the officials in Germany at the Potsdam Conference. So Truman himself is very excited about the successful test, and they could really start now to plan if and when to use this against the Japanese just in a few short weeks. When we get into 2 weeks later, of course, it's the end of July, and we're getting close to when that happens on August the 6th. I'll let you study that a little bit more. It's a fascinating document. I would encourage you to read all 14 pages of the report. That sounds a little cumbersome. It's typed, it's easy to read, and it's available on the Truman Library website. And it's quite a fascinating read. And the payoff is you get this sketch on the last page. The next document is what I mentioned previously, Truman's diaries. Now, he has a number of different diary entries, and I could have chosen really one of three that he writes in this time period. This one is July the 17th, 1945, so just the day after he gets that report. And of course, this is handwritten, and it can be hard to read, and those of us that work at the Truman Library have become familiar over time of Truman's handwriting. And this, of course, is when he's first meeting Joseph Stalin in this particular diary entry. We do have other diary entries from July the 18th, the next day, when he meets Churchill, and from July 25th, when he goes into a lot more detail about the atomic bomb testing. But he does mention it in this one page of his diary, and he's talking to Stalin about the different negotiations that are going to come up and they're setting the agenda. So this is very much at the beginning of the Potsdam Conference. And they're talking about China, and they're talking about the Soviets coming into the Japanese war on August 15th, which was one of Truman's goals at Potsdam to get the Soviets to join in there. But he has kind of a cryptic phrase in here. And he asked him about the agenda, and Truman says, I told him, this is about halfway down, I told him to fire away. He did, and it is dynamite. But then Truman says, but I have some dynamite too, which I'm not exploding now. So he kind of has this cryptic reference to dynamite and not exploding now. It's not too surprising that he mentions this the day after finding out about the successful test. I'm just using one of the diary entries today, but in the following day, on the 18th, he says that he believes the Japanese will surrender when the Russians come in, because Stalin does agree to enter the war. And then he has this phrase in the 18th of July entry where he says, I'm sure they will when Manhattan appears over their homeland. Now, Truman doesn't really refer to Manhattan very often in his writings, home to Bess and other correspondence, but on his diary entry of July 18th, he talks about Manhattan appearing over the Japanese homeland. Then he also goes on to say, I will inform Stalin about it at an opportune time. And in fact, during the Potsdam Conference, he does tell Stalin briefly, but not really in detail, about the fact that they have a new weapon that they can use against the Japanese. Truman didn't think that Stalin knew anything about that, but of course, as we know now in 2020, that Stalin did in fact have spies in New Mexico that were passing the information about the Manhattan Project back to him. And then a week later, on July 25th, on his diary entry there, he goes into a lot more detail, and he talks about how the weapon is to be used against the Japanese between now and the August 10th. So those diary entries are really very revealing as Truman expounds upon the information that he's been given by Lieutenant Groves. Now, we've got two contrasting documents here, or two documents that one is a little misleading. We're going to do that one second. I'm trying to keep them in chronological order if I can. This one is actually from the National Archives, which the Truman Library is part of, rather than the collections at the Truman Library. But this is the closest you would get to the ordering of the use of the atomic bomb. And this is a memo from Thomas Handy, who's the acting chief of staff while Marshall is at Potsdam with Truman. And he's writing to General Carl Spaatz, who's the Commander General of the United States Army Strategic Air Force. And you can see the date on this one is the 25th of July. So things are moving quickly, as you can see. And, you know, you can see this. It's not super sharp, but basically it's got 4 points on the single page memo. It talks about the 509 Composite Group, the 20th Air Force, will deliver its first special bomb as soon as weather will permit. And so they refer to it as the special bomb without using the word atomic. And then it talks about the various targets. And the first one there is Hiroshima, and the fourth one there listed is Nagasaki. The second point says that the additional bombs will be delivered on the above targets as soon as they are made ready by project staff. Now, we found out later that in the early part of August, only 2 bombs were ready, and they used both of them. The third bomb wasn't probably going to be ready until around the 16th or 17th of August. The third point there is that the dissemination of any information about this is reserved for the Secretary of War and the President. So the military are not going to make any comment about this, and any news stories, any people asking for information, they need to refer back to the Secretary of War and to the President for them to respond to. And then the last point is this is done with the approval of the Secretary of War, which I mentioned before, is Stimson and the Chief of Staff. And then it also mentions that a copy has been sent to General MacArthur and a copy has been sent to Admiral Nimitz. So this is the closest you're going to get to the actual orders for the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. And that's dated the 25th of July. And it does say after about August 3rd on there. So it does give a date for that. And at that point, they're waiting for a response for the Potsdam Declaration to the Japanese. Now, the other document that's often sometimes used incorrectly to talk about the authorization of the bomb is this memo and its response. And this is from the Secretary of War to Truman, and it's a few days later. It's the 30th of July. And this one is harder to read. And, you know, some of these historic documents can be difficult to read. But if you close in on this one, this is from Stimson to the president, and he's talking about the recent ultimatum. So that's the ultimatum that was made at Potsdam, and the dramatic results of the test that we've heard about already, and then suggestions made by the British, and of which Secretary of State Burns is well aware. And so he's giving recommendations of what to do. And I'm going to talk about the context of this in a minute. This is a two-pager because you can see in dark type the "see over." And Truman writes on the back of this memo, he says, Secretary of War, reply to you, and this is the number of the memo, 41011, suggestions approved, release when ready, but not sooner than August 2nd. And then again, Truman liked to use his initials, HST. Well, some people over time have thought when he says release when ready, he's talking about the atomic bomb. In fact, this is about the statement that's going to be released, like a press release, rather than a releasing of a bomb. So that's why there's confusion. I did want to point out again, I meant to do this before, the number of the memo is 41011, and that's what Truman uses there on the back. So this is an interesting document in that they're preparing the statements and they're saying, we better get this statement approved because once the bombs drop, we're going to need a statement immediately. So that's why there's a bit of a rush here, because they've been going back and forth in terms of what to say to the world once this bomb is actually dropped. And so they're trying to get the suggestions approved by both the British suggestions and the suggestions from Stimson himself and from Truman and from Burns and all of the others in the close circles of President Truman at that time. So that's a fascinating one, but it shouldn't be used to mislead. It's more about statement rather than the bomb itself. Okay, so now we're going to get closer and closer to that, to August 6th. The last one we're going to look at from July is a letter home to Bess. And he actually writes a number of letters to Bess. Of course, he takes about 2 weeks to get to Potsdam via the USS Augusta and goes across the Atlantic rather than flying. Many people argue he's done that to get ready, to prepare, to read the materials. But he was also under a lot of strain, and he used some of that time to rest as well and play poker and other things in the evening. And so he writes to Bess from the USS Augusta. And then when he gets finally to Germany, to Potsdam, he continues to write to her. During that time, he says very little in his letters about the atomic bomb. Obviously, there's some concern about secrecy, letters being intercepted, things of that nature. But in the July 31st letter, he does make a rather cryptic reference to that. Then we're going to look at some video footage of the newsreel of his announcement. Then we're going to look at the artifact of the safety plug, then the Sadako crane, and then we're going to finish with a video on the screen gems footage, which I'll explain when we get to that footage. So here's the letter to Bess, and this is just 2 pages of this. And as I mentioned, it was written July 31st. And of course, Truman's writing is not the easiest to read, the cursive. This is all digitized and on our website. And we have, it goes up every time I say these numbers. We have more than 1,300 letters written by Harry Truman to Bess Wallace Truman over their lifetime from 1910 to 1957, in most cases including the envelopes, which is amazing to have that in our collection. And all of those letters that Harry has written to Bess are all digitized and available on our website in chronological order. So you can go straight into July and look at those other letters. But this is the only one that really references the atomic bomb. And it's rather cryptic when he does so. But if you look at the bottom of the first page on the left, and then the beginnings of the second page on the right, he finishes up this bottom of this first page where he says, I rather think Mr. Stalin is stalling because he's not so happy about the English elections. And just to remind you, Winston Churchill had lost the elections in Great Britain during the Potsdam Conference, and he's replaced by Clement Attlee, the new Labour Prime Minister. And then Truman goes on to say at the bottom of the page, he doesn't know it, but I have an ace in the hole and another one showing. Now that ace in the hole, we're going to look at the transcript here. That ace in the hole is cryptic, but we believe he's talking about the atomic bomb. So here we see the transcript. It's a little easier to read. He talks about Secretary of State Burns and the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov and Attlee, who's the new British Prime Minister, and his Foreign Minister Bevin, all worked and accomplished a great deal. I rather think Stalin is stalling because he's not so happy, as we've already read. He doesn't know it, but I have an ace in the hole, and to continue that, and another one showing. Now, you know Truman loves his card games, so unless he has threes or two pair, and I know he is not, we're sitting all right. So that's the one time that he refers rather cryptically to the atomic bomb in his letters to his wife, Bess Wallace Truman. So I find that rather fascinating. Sometimes in historical documents, you learn from things that are not written there. And so the other 7 or 8 letters that he writes, he really makes no reference to the atomic bomb. And the same with letters to his mother and sister at the same time. If either no references or rather cryptic. Moving on. So we've got a video clip for you now, and this is Truman announcing the surrender from the USS, not the surrender, excuse me, announcing the dropping of the atomic bomb from the USS Augusta. So you can see the window in the background from the ship.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware.
Whoops. There we go. I'm going to talk about this next artifact in a moment, but I wanted to make a couple of comments about that newsreel. Firstly, I think the quality is remarkable. The definition of the video, I think, is really spectacular, and I feel very fortunate that it remains in that quality 75 years later. The second part of that is very, very compelling. You get the close-up video, and Truman looks at you with those eyes, and you know he means business. And I wonder about that when he's at a negotiating table with Stalin and Churchill, and later Clement Attlee, when Churchill is replaced. When he looked across the table, it seems like he would have that same serious stare when he made those tough decisions as president. So a really fascinating video. And then the fact that you can see the window on the USS Augusta behind him, giving you that sense of time and place as he's getting ready to come home, just as the atomic bomb has been dropped on Hiroshima. And the fact that the one thing that really comes up across to me there is he really means business. This next piece is an artifact, a three-dimensional artifact from our museum collection. And I'm going to do a close-up of the tag that's attached to this. Let me talk about the object first, and then the tag that's with it off to the side. I've got an upright view for you to look at that in a minute. First of all, this green, black, and silver plug is actually the safety plug taken out of the bomb fuse from the plutonium bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. And the description and the tag tells us that too. The green plug was removed and replaced with the red activating plug on the boxcar, the name of the B-29 that carried the bomb on its mission from Tinian. And the plane's commander, let me show you this. So this was the safety plug. It was removed. They put in the red activating plug, which of course went with the bomb. And then if you look on the next page here, you can see this more upright and a little easier to read. 10th of August, 1945, Tinian Island. I certify that this is one of the 2 green safety plugs used at Nagasaki, Japan on 9th of August, 1945. This was the second atomic bomb dropped on the Empire. And then the writing of the 2 gentlemen underneath, the second one's probably a little easier to read. I did some research on this. The commander, whose the name comes first, is Frederick Ashworth. He's one of the weaponeers. And then his assistant is Lieutenant Philip Barnes. And those are the 2 people that sign off on that to provide its authenticity. So a fascinating object. I'm going to go back so you can see that plug again. And I should say that this artifact and the tag will be on display in the renovated museum when we reopen the Truman Museum, Truman Library Museum later this year after our $30 million renovation. This safety plug will be in a special gallery dealing with the atomic bomb. And another artifact I'm going to show you a little bit later on will be in the same gallery. So a fascinating artifact. We're very fortunate to have it. And then the tag that goes with it just adds to the story. So that is really special. And the fact that Frederick Ashworth and Philip Barnes signed that, giving it that authenticity, is very much appreciated. So a really fascinating object. The next is its counterpart. And this is from a little bit later, and we've had this on display before at the Truman Library, and it's going to be displayed again in the same gallery space as the safety plug. They're going to juxtapose one another. And this is the paper crane made by Sadako Sasaki, and she was a Japanese girl who was a victim of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima when she was 2 years old. Now, she did survive, and the story is that during her early part of her life, in August 1955, she decided that she was going to start to make these paper cranes as a symbol of peace, and that was her wish. And there's different stories go back and forth of whether she accomplished that. The more recent research is that she actually made more than 1,000 cranes before her death. But there's children's stories about this crane, and this crane is rather small. We've got it blown up on the PowerPoint for you to see today, but it's very small. This is going to be displayed in the museum when we reopen, along with approximately 500 to 600 paper cranes made by students in the Kansas City area that have made paper cranes to go in the exhibit alongside this original paper crane. So we can help tell that story of Sadako. And the reason it's also really appropriate is this is part of the peace and reconciliation efforts made by Truman's grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel, in the last decade or more, where he has been to Japan and reached out. And I think it's largely through his efforts that we were able to get one of the last surviving cranes from Sadako donated to the library's museum collection. So all of those things have kind of come full circle with the connection between Clifton Truman Daniel and the Japanese, and of course the peace efforts after 1945, and the fact that the Sadako family would allow that to be donated to the library is very special. And I think that when you see the renovated museum when we reopen later this year, with both the safety plug and the Sadako crane sharing the same space, it's really going to be a very meaningful approach and interpretation to that episode in history. Moving on, we've got one more video to show you. And before I press play, you might want to do it itself. I'm trying to not let it do that. This is when Truman looks back in the 1960s, when he's asked about the atomic bomb. He never really wavered much from his belief that it was the right thing to do. In 1964 and 1965, there was a television series looking at Truman's decisions, and the Truman Library is very fortunate to have many of these outtakes now on the Truman Library YouTube channel. And this is one of those. It's quite short, where he talks about the decision to drop the atomic bomb.
So when we issued the ultimatum to Japan to surrender, the only answer we got was to go to the devil. Yet all this time, some of their people seemed to be acting behind their backs of the cabinet, trying to sue for peace in one underhand way or another. Well, when they applied that way, we knew that there was only one of two things to do. We could advance on Japan and fight every inch of the way, losing 1 million of our own men, or drop the atomic bomb. We dropped the bomb. And still there was no reaction. We learned later that the Japanese cabinet met, and finally there were enough who agreed to surrender to split the cabinet in half. One half in favor of surrender, the other determined to fight on. In this spirit, the emperor was finally called on to give his opinion, an unprecedented move. He didn't want his people to die any more than he wanted to surrender. Yet the military was so strong, they still wouldn't notify us of their capitulation. So we had to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki. That did it. The cabinet met again and really decided. But that wasn't the end. They notified us that they would accept an unconditional surrender, but implied that the condition that this emperor might be retained in some way. The emperor made a recording of a pronouncement to the Japanese people for the radio. The first time the Japanese populace ever heard his voice. Yet, don't you think that one military group didn't speak into the offices, to break into the offices and try to record, and try to head off that record so it couldn't be broadcast. They did broadcast it, and they surrendered. I'll tell you, without those two A-bombs dropped on them to show we meant business, they might never have surrendered, even though they knew they would be licked, but they would have killed 3 million more people on both sides. That's why there is no question that in view of the hold the Japanese military had on their people, the dropping of the atom bombs was the only sensible thing to do. It was the only thing to do.
Okay, I think those are my 10 artifacts, and I think we're ready for questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark, for a wonderful presentation. If you have a question and haven't added it to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, please go ahead and do so now. You can also like a question that has already been submitted that you would like to see answered. So our first question is, were the targets listed in that document in priority order? If so, what moved up Nagasaki to be the second location?
I don't believe that they were in priority order, no. They were there, and then a lot of the decision was going to be based on the weather. And so I know that for Nagasaki, the weather was much more cooperative than some other locations. So as far as I understand it, I don't believe that those were priority. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it was more weather dependent.
Excellent. Okay, our next question comes from Zachary, and it says, how did the museum get the plug? Is there a story about its provenance?
I believe it was donated by Commander Ashworth and Lieutenant Barnes, but I can double check that, but that's what I understand.
Excellent.
And I think it may have, I think, just to clarify, it may have been passed from Ashworth onto others. I don't think he directly met President Truman, but it was passed through the chain to be given to President Truman eventually.
All right, our next question comes from Ed. Were the materials couriered to Potsdam, just trying to better understand the manner of document exchange in very different times?
They were often couriered, although they did have telegraph system.
All right, our next question comes from Thomas, who asks, how was the report sent to Truman from the U.S. to Potsdam? Was it timely? So that, sorry, I didn't read that in advance.
All right.
Basically the same question. All right, next one from Deborah. Where are the videos available? Great question.
So there are videos available. I love that question. The Truman Library has its own YouTube channel, and probably the easiest way to get to it, rather than give you a long URL, is if you go to trumanlibrary.gov, which should be easy to remember, scroll to the very bottom of the page and you'll see the little icon for YouTube, little play button. You click on that button and you go all the way into, it'll take you directly to the Truman Library YouTube page. And then what I really like about the way that page is organized is there are playlists. So you can look at playlists and find the area of history you're particularly interested in. So if you're interested in the 1948 election campaign, or you're interested in Truman's earlier life or post-presidency, they're organized in that way so you can see different eras of Truman's life and times and presidency through those playlists. Because we've actually added quite a lot during the last few months.
Excellent. All right, our next question comes from Michael, and it says, what is your response to the claim that we dropped the bomb to show the Russians that we meant business and not the Japanese?
You know, I'm going to sound a little like a politician here. So I'm a federal employee, and we preserve and document all of the materials related to President Truman and his life and times. And really our goal is to let you to decide, as the researcher, to come and look at the materials either on our website or in person when we reopen after COVID-19 ends, and decide for yourself based on the evidence. Of course, individually, you might have individual opinions about things, but as a federal employee and as a federal institution, we encourage you to research and decide for yourself. And we don't dictate what the opinion should be. And honestly, we hope that our new museum exhibits that open later this year are the same tenant, that you decide for yourself on the accomplishments of President Truman, good or bad.
Excellent. All right, the next question comes from Kim, and it says, will there be any documents about Ketsu-Go in the new exhibit? In the old one, the room about the bomb did not have this. Few people know about the training of the Japanese civilians to attack our soldiers. Truman's aide, George Elzey, remarked about that to author Dennis Giangreco.
I believe that that particular episode is not necessarily covered in the exhibits itself, although it sounds like a great public program. But we do have a number of audio pieces that look at the Japanese perspective alongside the American perspective on the reactions to the dropping of the bomb in a very balanced way. So both American and Japanese perspectives on the use of the bomb are used in an audio program that we plan to have in that same gallery where we have the Sadako crane and the safety plug. We obviously realize what an incredibly controversial decision it was by President Truman. We are very well aware of the Smithsonian and the Enola Gay controversy in the 1990s. And our goal is to present the information and allow the visitor to decide. And we have a comment book that we've had in the past when we've dealt with the atomic bomb, and we're going to have again so that people can reflect their own opinion there. But we are going to try and provide all the information that we can from both sides, or multiple opinions, more than two sides, in that gallery space.
Excellent. Our next question comes from Bart, and it says, is there any evidence that President Truman deliberated to use the weapons or not? Any history of any moral debate?
There's some, but not a whole lot. I think Truman had the main goal of ending the war as quickly as possible. Now, there's a couple of things that are factoring in at the same time as the testing is taking place in New Mexico and what they deemed as a successful test. In that same month, in July, as you may well know, the United States had broken the codes of Japanese intelligence, and they were receiving, and I think I'm right on this, around about 1 million messages a month from the Japanese. One of the crucial threads they were following was where the Japanese buildup of troops were for a planned land invasion by the United States. And those land invasion intercepts, the Japanese were actually building up their troops in far greater numbers in exactly the locations the American forces were going to land with an invasion in the fall and then the following spring. And so there was certainly some hesitation about a land invasion once they started to read those intercepts. The other part of that, of course, was really they decided after looking at those intercepts that the Japanese, although some of those were saying they wanted to negotiate a surrender through the Russians, they really were not ready for an unconditional surrender. So I think that the intelligence code breaking really just reinforced Truman and Secretary Stimson's opinion to use the weapon as quickly as possible and to end the war as quickly as possible. When Truman was questioned about it later, you saw that video from the 1960s. He often reminded people about Pearl Harbor and that the fact that that attack had happened while they were not at war, and arguments of that nature.
Interesting. All right, our next question comes from Corey, and it says, how great of a role did Secretary of State Stimson have in this decision, if any?
It was Secretary of War Stimson, just to be careful about the right title. He was crucial. Not only did he really head up the Manhattan Project, overseeing, he was Grove's supervisor in a sense, to use our modern day terminology for that. So he was obviously very much the first person to find out what was happening with the Manhattan Project, but he was also a very close confidant to Truman. You saw my very first document in the presentation. He's the one that tells Truman about it. When the interim committee meets in the summer, Stimson is really the one that's not making the decisions, but certainly at the forefront of those decisions, and was a really key player. I wouldn't say one person over another made those decisions, but if in the top 5, Stimson's certainly one of those who Truman goes to for advice and leans on for suggestions of what to do. And Stimson's involved in discussions later about sharing the information with the Soviets and the setup of the Atomic Energy Commission and all of these other things that Stimson was already seeing what the world would look like after the war was over. What would we do with this power and how would it be shared with the world? So Stimson was rather far-reaching in that regard.
All right, we have time for a few more questions. Our next one comes from Jordan, and it says, how did Truman's family react to the dropping of the atomic bomb?
I think, this is a harder question because as far as I'm aware, there's not a great deal of evidence that we have, and we like as historians and archivists and educators to rely on evidence for a response. But as everything I've read about first Bess Wallace Truman and then Margaret Truman is they were entirely supportive of Truman. There's not too many decisions that I've found that they may have disagreed with Truman on, or if they did, they didn't express it publicly. Unfortunately, I mentioned all of those letters that Truman wrote that we have in the museum and library collection, but we really don't have Bess Wallace Truman's letters after the time that he's senator. So when he's vice president and when he's president, we don't have any of Bess's letters. They were burned. She burned them. And so we don't have that evidence to say exactly what she thought about it, but I can only imagine she was supportive of him and that the war was over and very quickly after that. So I can't imagine that there would be any criticism of what he did as president in this particular case.
All right, and our last question comes from Pat, who asks, were there ever any thoughts of using the bomb on Tokyo?
There were some early discussions of that. One of the reasons the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with the weather, they wanted to use the bomb on cities that had not received any kind of destruction. So it was, easy is the wrong word, but that's the only word I can think of right now. It was easier to see the level of destruction. Tokyo, as you know, had received a lot of fire bombings and a lot of napalm and other attacks. So it would have been a little more difficult to show the level of destruction that the atomic bomb was capable of doing. And so that was one of the reasons why Tokyo was not chosen, because of already received damage in the past. Mm. These are great questions, by the way. Keep them going.
Oh, let's do a few more then. All right. So our next question comes from Deline that says, I have always heard Truman felt remorse after the dropping of the bomb. Did he revisit that decision later in life?
Yeah, that was one of the reasons I showed that video clip at the end from 1964-65. He didn't seem to show much remorse there, and he lives for another 7 years now. Clifton Truman Daniel told a story back in April about how he kind of questioned that right towards the end of his life in 1972. And there is some conversations he has actually at Research Hospital in Kansas City, where he passes away on December 26, 1972, where he kind of has some discussions then about that. I'm obviously not party to those conversations, but from what I can tell, there was maybe some, I don't want to say second guessing, but just clarification of did I do the right thing? Was it the right thing to do right towards the end, as far as I can tell. But Clifton Truman Daniel, I know, has relayed a story about that in the past, about maybe some comments in the last year or two of his life where he wonders about that at the very end, which seems quite natural to me. And I mean, most of the time he makes those decisions as president, and of course he was responsible for so many in that 7.5 years as president. He didn't really look back at them, but it's not too surprising that he may have questioned this one. When he was questioned publicly, whether it was on the television series I mentioned to you or in writing, as I mentioned before, he often referred back to Pearl Harbor and the attack by the Japanese as a large part of his justification. And the second part was that he was saving lives. The other part about saving lives that Richard Frank, the historian, brings up, and even though it wasn't Truman's intent, he saved a number of Asian lives because of Japanese occupation of Asian countries. Richard Frank estimates, 400,000 Japanese were saved a month, I believe it is, by the fact that the Japanese were surrendered and no longer were causing those atrocities in Asia, according to Richard Frank, rather than me. So that's another set of lives that were saved by the speedier surrender than otherwise would have happened.
Excellent. Our next question is from James, who says, did Truman ever visit Japan?
No, he did not. Now, I mentioned before, his grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel, has visited numerous times, but Truman did not visit Japan, no.
All right. And
I like
William
those short
asks,
answers. Short answers are
yeah.
good.
This, I think, is definitely the most questions we've ever answered during
That's
a program.
right.
It's great.
This is a big topic, and it's a big anniversary.
Yeah. All right. William asked, what was the timeline of decision-making by President Truman between the first and the second use of the atomic bomb?
So there really wasn't a second decision. The way it's been explained to me is that he authorized the military's use of the bomb. And so they had this new weapon and they were able to use it. Once the reports came in of the amount of devastation and things like that, then after the second bomb, then Truman said, no, for the future use of this, it goes back to the executive, it goes back to the president as commander-in-chief. So when he gave the first authorization for Hiroshima, there was no second order needed. It was used as necessary. You have this new weapon. Now there were only two. So it's that even existed at that time. The third wasn't going to be ready until August 16th or 17th, according to Groves. So there wasn't a third decision to be made. But by then, if there had been one, if they were ready to use one and Japan had not already surrendered, then it would have been Truman's decision again. But the first two, it was only one decision. That's often misunderstood, but there was only one decision for the first two bombs.
All right. Edward asks, what would be your recommendation for the best book dealing with the decision to drop the bombs?
Richard Frank, Downfall of the, I think it's Imperial Japanese Empire or something like that. But Downfall is the main name and it has the subheading. But Richard Frank's book, because it's, even though it's a little old now, it does include the information about the ultra and magic intercepts, which some of the earlier studies done did not include because a lot of those came out later on. And he also did a lot of his research with Japanese and Soviet archives as well.
All right. Next question comes from Deborah, and it says, was there anyone in Congress that knew about the Manhattan Project?
You got me. Probably. Probably. Very few, though. It was a very tight circle, but I would hate to say no, because there was a very tight circle there. It's hard to say. I think you'd have to go back and look at the interim committee notes and see who served on that committee. I don't think it got much further than that. Those minutes and notes are on our website. I'd have to go back and look. I would imagine there was a few lead senators that were involved in those discussions, but very, very few. I'm not going to say a blanket no. I think there was a few. Sorry to be not so precise on that one.
All right, our last question comes from Robin, who says, did Truman and Oppenheimer ever meet?
Gosh. Actually, and you know, you got me. This is like stumped. I don't know that, actually. We will get back to you on that. One of our archivists may well have to look that up. We have appointment calendars online. If I was quick on my fingers, I would do a search for Oppenheimer on our appointment calendar and see if his name pops up because it's in a database. He may well, that would just be his presidential appointments. So I actually don't know off the top of my head whether he did meet Oppenheimer or not. I would guess that he did, but I'm just guessing. But our appointment calendar could probably come up, although it may have been secret meetings and not recorded too. So that doesn't, it's not an all exclusive answer for that. But I would say right off the top of my head, I'm very sorry, I can't answer that question accurately.
All right,
now
we'll
I'm gonna look it up as soon as we get done though.
All right, we'll take a third final question then. So from Dave, who says, do you have any more information on the Soviet spies that infiltrated the A-bomb development program in New Mexico?
We do actually, and that's a whole other topic for discussion, but it's pretty obvious that we know on record now that the spies were in New Mexico. Truman did not know about them at the time. A lot of it came out later on about those spies, and so that's a whole other presentation. But later on it was found that there were spies in New Mexico, and I believe it's in 1949 that the Soviets have, by that time they have their atomic bomb. So it's another 4 years later, but it's shortly after. So yeah, there is a lot of information at the Truman Library about that, and in other sources as well about those Soviet spies, and there's been books written about it as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and special thanks to Mark Adams for this excellent and informative presentation. To find more information about the project currently taking place at the library, you can visit our website at trumanlibraryinstitute.org, where we have a detailed timeline of the renovation with behind-the-scenes photos and videos. You can also find more information about future programs commemorating the 75th anniversary of Truman's presidency, like the August 6th conversation with Chris Wallace, on our website as well. And be sure to follow the Truman Library Institute and the Truman Library on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for all things Truman. Thanks again, Mark, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us.